All right, welcome to Intereach 2023. Happy January, everybody. We're very excited that everyone could make it. And I'm very excited to briefly introduce, so we can have as much time as possible, our speaker, Dr. Evan Hepler-Smith, who is one of those people that when I met him, my first reaction was like, why didn't I meet this person 10 years ago? This would have been so helpful because of the way that he thinks and what he works on. So I'm just really, really excited for all of you to get to hear from and get to know Evan. He is an assistant professor of history at Duke University in the Department of History. And he's many things that you'll hear about, but he does some intense boundary spanning at the core. He is a historian of modern science and technology. You may have seen that he specializes in the global history of chemistry. So I met him as a nanotechnology risk assessor, and I was like, wow, this is the most relevant talk that I've seen to what I'm trying to do in a STEM world. And computing and information technology and environmental health. I think he will share with us some of his projects that really integrate across humanities history and chemical histories and environmental aspects of that, all kinds of stuff. So I am thrilled that Dr. Hepler-Smith was able to join us, and I will pass it off on behalf of our community to Evan to take the floor and enjoy the next hour, everybody.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Christine. And thanks to Christine for the chance to speak to you all today. And thanks to you all for taking the time to chat with me virtually today. Like Christine G, I've got a little one, an 11-week-old at home. So I appreciate the reference to the scientist in the crib. As well, Veronica, thanks. And I'll also mention that there's an excellent history of science book on this, the history of the idea of babies and children, learners as scientists, and science in turn working in the same way that the cognitive development of children works. It's by a friend of mine named Henry Coles. The book's entitled The Scientific Method: An Evolution of Thinking from Darwin to Dewey. I can put that in the chat later on as well. This is sort of a nice, nicely illustrates a point that I'd like to make, or an argument I'd like to make in my talk today, which is that there's kind of a history of science book about everything, almost every conceivable topic you might come up with when it comes to science thinking, boundary spanning, the relationships between science and society, collaboration in science. Historians of science have spent kind of our stock in trade is thinking about the history of the sorts of ideas that inform work in these fields, I think. Or, that's at least how it seems to me, and I'll be curious to if you all get the same impression from your side of things. So I'll just get started here. I want to start us off with a little exercise. So go ahead and use the chat, and I'm going to give you a source, one of my favorite sources. Keep it in my wallet, actually, from the history of science. So just take a look at this this source and tell me, what's going on here? What is the science? Who are the scientists who seem to be involved in the production of this historical source? What kinds of episodes do you think in the history of science, or kinds of factors influencing the development of science and technology, might we learn something about, or ask some questions about through paying attention to this source? Excellent. Christine says standard mathematical functions, things like sines and cosines might be something whose history we could trace. Civil engineering. All right, excellent. We've got a National Bureau of Standards local to New York. We can think about the organization of the institutions in which science is done. Uses of math for human resource applications. We've got a New Deal project, the Works Project Administration. US federal government is putting people to work, producing a mathematical tool, a table of sines and cosines. Scientists are administrators. Christine mentions, Diane mentions the Work Progress Administration. Excellent. So we're starting to get this picture of a little corner of science, of scientific collaboration, or collaboration involving science round about the late 1930s, leading up to the publication of this table in 1940. So we can think about the work that is the scientific work documented in this library card. We can also think about the people who might have been using this library card itself. Think about who might be sitting in a science library, in this case, the Fine Hall Library at Princeton University, the Math and Engineering Library, perusing this table of sines and cosines. What might they have been doing with it? What did science look like when you looked up sines and cosines in a table like this? And you might also ask about how it came to be that a library card allowing people to find this long table of trigonometric functions compiled by a bunch of people who the Work Project Administration put to work in the 1930s, got deaccessioned from the card catalog and dropped where I found it in a stack of scrap paper in this library circa 2013 or 2014, such that I scrawled down a bunch of called numbers on the back of it before even realizing what was on the front of this card. So there's a kind of crypto history of transitions in the sorts of information technologies used by folks working in and around the sciences and engineering that one can read from this historical source as well. So my field, the field of history of science, and more broadly, the interdisciplinary field of science studies, or science and technology studies, STS, asks questions about the boundaries that define and constitute the practice of science and the making of technology, borrowing methods and concepts from adjacent fields, anthropology, philosophy, and sociology. Historians of science like me and other STS scholars surface span and interrogate boundaries in our work, boundaries between disciplines, between research paradigms, between different kinds of work, intellectual work of science, political work of making science happen, both locally, the micropolitics of collaborations, and in a broader sense, the politics of funding and of government and industrial support, and just the kind of regular kind of work, the labor of many sorts that goes into doing science. We look at boundaries between science and technology, between researchers and research subjects. Indeed, researchers are, for the most part, the research subjects of historians of science, past researchers. Boundaries between science and society. How does science interact with society? Is the scientific enterprise really all that separate as it's made out to be sometimes from broader, broader social developments? What is the what forms of society come into being within science that allow science to happen and structure how scientific collaboration, research production works, and boundaries between the past and the present. right? What does science look like today, or research practice more generally? And how did science come to be that way? And in what ways are we ourselves implicated, part of this long-term and ongoing history of the development of specific disciplines, and the ebb of flow of the connections among them? And how are we contributing to this history? How are we products of, shaped by, but also makers of, shapers of the ongoing development of research collaboration, and the consequences, positive and negative and mixed and complicated, of all of that science? This is the kinds of thing that people in my field, historians of science, are interested in. So I'm going to share with you today two, and maybe time permitting, three sort of general concepts that some historians of science have come up with in telling stories such as these about the history of science and technology, and go through a couple examples of how I have borrowed these ways of thinking about science and technology in some of my own work. And what I'd like you all to do as we go along is think about what I'm sharing with you, and think about how some of these ideas, some of these ways of conceptualizing scientific collaboration and interdisciplinarity, and such things, how might they be useful for you? Feel free to throw suggestions about how you think they might be useful for you, or how they might connect to some of the work that you found yourself involved in, or indeed how some of the work you've involved in might defy the generalizations made in some of these ways of thinking about science and technology, challenge some of these models of science, of research practice. And feel free to make use of the chat, throw some of these ideas in. Hopefully we can make this conversational. I'm going to be jumping around a little bit anyway, because I'm the parent of an 11-week-old and I have the attention span of a goldfish. So don't be shy about jumping in as well. And I think if the history of science and some of the authors who I'll be discussing today have taught me anything, it is that knowledge is dialogical. It is made through conversation. It's not embodied in static sentences that you read from the page. So hopefully we can have a little bit of conversation here today. Great. Any questions about that or objections? Excellent. Okay. So I want to start off with a book, a very thick book. You don't have to read it. It is this thick. It's called Image and Logic by a historian of science named Peter Galison. And Galison, who is himself also trained in physics, in this book asks a question, a general question about scientific disciplines. And this question comes out of some of the work in the field of history and philosophy of science throughout the 20th century. Some of you might be familiar with a book by the historian philosopher Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. This is the book that popularized the idea of the paradigm as a term for the way that practice works within a given field at a given time, and a paradigm shift or a change in paradigm as a way of speaking of the radical break in ways of thinking about what a good problem is and how you go about solving it within a field of science, or as the term has evolved more generally, particularly within business sectors and technology and industry sectors. In the past decades, and the challenge that this Kuhn idea of thinking about paradigm shifts and these very different ways that scientists go about doing their work and thinking about their fields at different points in time, from, for example, the period of classical physics before Einstein's development of the theory of relativity, before the advent of quantum mechanics, and modern physics following relativity and quantum mechanics. The challenge this conceptualization of science poses is kind of like, how the heck do people ever manage to communicate with each other in the first place, right? How is it possible that there is some kind of continuity in these fields of science over time? How is it possible that people who are trained in seemingly very different ways of defining problems and solving them do in fact empirically manage to come together and collaborate and produce scientific results that have authority, that have credibility, that stick in the community? And Galison asks this question of the field of high energy physics, particle physics. And in this book, he traces the development of particle physics from the early 20th century when experimental high energy physicists used instruments like cloud chambers to generate images of elementary particles, causing water vapor to condense as they travel through this cloud, or Geiger counters, which click when a certain particle causes a discharge of electricity, allowing you to count the number of particles that go through the space of the counter. Small tabletop instruments, very different sort of instruments, right? One of them clicks, another one you take pictures of trails of particles. To the kinds of instruments used in particle physics today, accelerator physics, things like the 20-some kilometer ring of the Large Hadron Collider in CERN outside of Geneva in Switzerland, with this huge construction project that requires getting communities on board with this big facility being built, and engineers building and maintaining this enormous instrument, and a whole bunch of people in a big control room looking at a bunch of readouts, interpreting lots of variegated, heavily processed data, and eventually in 2012 telling you that there's such a thing as a Higgs boson, actually. So Galison's question is, how do we think about how this is the same kind of enterprise, and how high energy physics has changed from the era where either you were taking pictures of trails in clouds or counting clicks in Geiger counters to this present day era of huge, enormous, multi-sited collaborations involving places like CERN. So as regards the first question that we posed, right, how does science change? Galison points out that there are a couple models that philosophers of science had come up with for thinking about how this might work. Maybe these different theories are just different ways of effectively making sense of the same underlying observations, the same experimental data. You've got the data, and then you come up with a theory to best make sense of it. But then you get more data, and you add it to the old data, and maybe another theory, or maybe you just come up with a better idea. You apply it to that same data, and now you have a new theory, and the new theory accounts for the data better. But then you get some even more data, and it turns out that a third theory accounts for the data better. And that's one way of thinking about how change in science might work. Just more data and subsequent theories more and more effectively matching it. Another way of telling this story, more in line with Kuhn's argument in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, is it makes use of this concept of a paradigm, right? An approach to doing science that's not just about theories, but also about how you collect data, the sorts of instruments you use. Are you using cloud chambers, or are you using Geiger counters, or are you using big instruments with lots of electronics and statistical software going into them? And so you're collecting different kinds of data and forming a different kind of theory. And then when a new theory comes into being, a lot of the old data suddenly seems less relevant. Or also you get new data that causes the old theory to seem less relevant, as well as the old data. And the collection of experimental data and the formulation of theories kind of change, jump from one regime to the next, right? Classical physics to quantum physics, so forth. Galison, in this, again, very thick book, by paying lots of close attention to the instruments that these physicists were using, how they were using them, how they were talking about them, the kinds of experiments they were doing with them, how they were using different kinds of instruments together, how engineers were involved in not just building instruments, but also designing them through their understanding of the limits and possibilities of electronics and so forth, comes up with a different way of accounting for how science develops. Galison argues that, it's not that there's this body of data and theories that's constant and theories change on top of it. It's not that there are these paradigms in which science is just done in entirely different ways, but that there are different levels within a discipline of specialization. Specialization in instruments, specialization in theories, specialization in doing experiments and verifying the validity of experimental data. And continuity in one of these levels enables change in another of these levels. And furthermore, the separation between these levels is a crucial source of the strength, the integrity of the field as a whole. That is, because experiment and theory aren't entirely yoked together, because they sort of involve different ways of thinking, different norms of practice, different understandings of what it means to do good science, different definitions of basic entities, like even what an electron is, different working ways of understanding these entities. Because there's this separation, you can have a change in theory without the experimentalists getting too worked up about it. And because there's this continuity in experimental methods and in instruments, it is possible to have a shift from one theoretical model to another without the entirety of the field seeming to come apart. And so it is the sort of separateness of different parts of even a seemingly quite specific discipline like particle physics, the existence of these separate subcultures within it that enables the integrity of the field. So it's kind of a, unity in partial independence sort of argument. So that's his answer to this first question about change over time. And hand in hand with this is an answer he provides to this second question of, okay, so like at any given point in time, then, how is it that if you've got engineers who are trained in certain ways to think about how electrons flow through wires, and experimentalists who think about electrons or other charged particles as making certain kinds of traces and detectors, and theorists who have a bunch of fancy mathematics for talking about what an electron's probability cloud is, and so forth. How is it that they come to work together to discover the Higgs boson in this huge 1,000-person collaborations at facilities like CERN? So borrowing concepts from the field of, and thanks for your question, Veronica, I'll come back to that. Borrowing concepts from the field of linguistic anthropology, who studies how, we've got some examples out there in the world of people from different cultures coming together to get something done, specifically how linguistic anthropologists talk about trade among different cultures, different people coming together, speaking different languages, different cosmologies, different ways of understanding the world, manage to exchange stuff back and forth between each other. And some of the terms that anthropologists use to discuss this process and the languages employed, this process of trade, are these terms for interlanguages, languages that mediate between languages, pidgins and creoles. So a pidgin is a term linguists and anthropologists for a contact language, a language of exchange between culture, constructed when you've got at least two separate cultures with their own active languages, and then they simplify and restrict the vocabulary and, kind of the scope or complexity of the concepts in each to use a few words that allow members of each of these cultures to have a working understanding of what each other is talking about, sufficient for trading stuff back and forth, even if the stuff that they're trading has profoundly different meanings, significance for members of the two cultures. Occasionally, there are enough people who are involved in a constant enough way in this kind of trading or in these kinds of spaces and living and working in these kinds of spaces that a language of this sort gains its own extension and complexity and becomes a new language, a creole. So you can think of exchange zones such as colonized places that develop their own creole languages that then are, their own veritable languages that people are born into and live within and operate within. And so a pidgin of this sort becomes a native language. And so Galison applies this idea to science. And he says, this is how, this is a way we can use of thinking about how members of these different cultures, scientific cultures, trained in different ways with different ideas of the basic entities that they're working with, manage to come together and work together and simplify some of their own complex and quite different ways of thinking about practice in order to engage in a collaboration requiring working together across these boundaries. And so Galison defines the spaces where people come together to do this as what he calls trading zones, again, borrowing, indicating that he's borrowing this metaphor from anthropology of exchange. And he defines science as this intercalated, right, kind of unevenly layered set of subcultures that use these interlanguages, to work together, bound together through their use of these languages. And he wants to include not just literally the words that people use in speaking together to engage in collaboration, but also their mathematical methods and their ways of using instruments and so on. All the other parts of scientific practice can be simplified to be included within these pidgins, these interlanguages of collaboration. So Veronica, you asked how experiment in the last model was differed from observation in the first two. I think sort of Galison, in his specific study of physics, wants to separate, a philosopher's idea of empirical observation, which sort of is just this general, all of the empirical stuff about science, and say, well, like it's not just people looking out at the world, at least in the case of physics that he's interested in, there's making instruments and there's doing experiments. And both making instruments and doing experiments are crucial to the history that he's telling, but they're different from each other. Making the instruments and using the instruments are separate. Great to see, Christine, that you're working on a living dictionary. I've seen some really interesting efforts in the chemistry space with folks working in web ontologies, in web ontology language, trying to come up with flexible ways of defining terms that are sufficiently precise to be useful in computational applications, like text mining sorts of stuff, but also sufficiently broad and flexible to accommodate these kinds of differences in more specific understandings of what something like, in the case of chemistry, a molecular entity might be. All right, so that's a bunch of stuff that I threw at you really quickly. Any specific questions about this model science before I go on to how I use it? If you have any questions, feel free to throw them into the chat.
I have one, but I'm formulating it, so I'm gonna hold off.
All right. Well, thank you for.
Oh, so sorry. I was curious if this idea, I'm sure you may get into this, but when I'm looking at these definitions and thinking how they work, it seems like there's kind of a, without digging into it, there's an assumption that there is an intention to get across the right meaning, that everyone's using language to put as close a fit on a shared meaning as possible. And I'm wondering if there are extensions of this anthropological concept that sort of help with defining other barriers to it, sort of like a free market assumes everyone's acting rationally, and we know that that doesn't happen, type of thing. So are there different extensions? I'd be curious to hear through what you're saying that get at what happens when people are actually getting in their own way or hearing things wrong or trying to have turf wars over the terms and that kind of thing. So I'll leave it there.
No, that's an excellent point. And one of the other another model for thinking about science coming out of work in sociology from science, especially in the 1970s into the 1980s, is that scientists are just fierce political competitors, right? Just trying to play power games with each other. And one can think about scientific collaboration as, just an exercise in politics all the way down to the bottom, where the game is to get the most credit and funding and the other markers of achievement as one might seek to get, and to form alliances and identify and fight with rivals to that end. And Gallison's approach is a much more fundamentally intellectual, model or way of understanding science. And I think that has much to do with what he studies. He's studying this field of high energy physics in a period when it's flush with cash. Tellingly, his story ends before the decision not to fund, by the US government, not to fund a huge, super expensive instrument, which would have been sort of the same scope as the Large Hadron Collider, the superconducting super collider, which was canceled in the early 90s. And one of the critiques of this model is that it doesn't necessarily account for bad faith, for power dynamics, for all of these other aspects that we often see present in many scientific collaborations. Nor does it account for more chance of collaboration, less well-integrated collaborations than you might see in a specific and fairly well-defined disciplinary field like particle physics. So I'll say a few words about how I have taken up some of Gallison's ideas in a book I'm working on. This is a book on what I think of as the history of modern chemistry, but the information history of modern chemistry. That is to say, a history of modern chemistry told through the practices of collecting, synthesizing, and accessing information from across, from the published record of chemistry across the past couple of centuries. Taking that as the through line in the history of this field of science, rather than, say, thinking about different ideas of what atoms are and whether they exist, or different kinds of instruments, laboratory apparatus used by chemists, or different kinds of industries and the growth and development of chemical industries. And one of the questions that I pose to sort of motivate this study is this question, whose history one can trace, seems like a more intellectual question of what a chemical substance is. What are different ways of thinking about what are the entities of chemistry? What's the stuff of chemistry? And people have had all sorts of different ways of thinking about what the stuff of chemistry might be, ranging in scale from bulk materials that you can put on a lab bench or manufacture in a factory to very, very small, perhaps even imperceptible, non-observable entities. So here's the axis of scale, here's the axis of historical time. This is kind of a cartoon of different answers to this question that have emerged historically. Some of them, the lightly shaded ones, are very loosely defined. Chemicals, well, some of them are minerals. That's a class of chemicals. Some of them are mixtures. Some of them are solutions. There's a class of substances we can think of as wastes and residues, the stuff that comes out of industrial processes that is other than their intentional outputs. Some of them are very specifically or precisely defined. Crystals, right, defined by a certain physical shape and certain chemical constituents. Stereoisomers, chemical substances with a specific three-dimensional structure to them. And so on and so forth. Nanomaterials, slightly more loosely defined, not quite at the smallest scale, but somewhere in the middle here more recently. And one thing that's interesting, if you look at broad discussions of chemistry, both in chemical fields themselves, but especially in fields adjacent to chemistry or crossing the boundaries among chemical subdisciplines, is that there are very specific ways of answering this question that often are not especially sophisticated theoretically, like they're not cutting edge in terms of chemical theories in any field, but they've stuck. So for example, if you think back to something like the 2014 spill of a bunch of a coal processing chemical in a river in West Virginia, that was big news back about 9 years ago now, stuff called MCHM. The way it was identified in news coverage, in some of the first environmental toxicology studies that came out about this stuff, was according to its molecular structure. Of course, like we always see chemicals showing up, a cyclohexane ring, 6 carbons, a methanol moiety up here, a methane moiety down here, specific relationship to each other. So it's 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 methyl cyclohexane methanol. But as scientists started to study this stuff more, and indeed, if you asked any chemist, what is this stuff really, they would say, well, it's complicated. There are actually 2 different isomers of this stuff. There's the cis isomer and the trans isomer. And then if you ask so if you ask an organic chemist, they'll say, well, this is actually 2 things. And then if you ask an industrial chemist, they'll say, well, like, a stuff in a tank in West Virginia is not going to be pure anything. There's no such thing as absolute purity, and that's especially true of technical chemicals used in industry. And actually this stuff is a mixture. There are various other similar chemical compounds alongside it, and that were spilled into the river. And then if you think about why this stuff was in a river in West Virginia, it turns out to be the byproduct of the production of a advanced plastic by Eastman Chemical in Tennessee, which in turn emerged as an alternative to bisphenol A that didn't have that characteristic endocrine disrupting structure of BPA, polycarbonate plastic. So, you could think of this stuff as the leftovers from making an alternative plastic to a substance that had been identified as as dangerous to health. But we don't think about it in these ways. It gets defined by default as MCHM. If you're going to talk about it, you're going to talk about MCHM, this molecular structure. So, why is that? This is a 125-year-old conception of what chemicals are, but it's so persistent. And my book goes through a range of these different kinds of material substances, actual stuff worked with in the world, different problems in history of science, questions about prediction or quantification, or naming, or relationship between science and empire, and so forth. But really at the core of the whole thing is like this question of why are these certain ways of thinking about chemical substances so persistent? And the answer, to make a long story short, has to do with this kind of diverse, variegated collection of different stuff involved in the practice of chemistry that are the sort of information technologies, if you like, of chemistry: reference books, tables, indexes, nomenclature rules, databases. And throughout the past 250 years of chemistry, these sorts of things have constituted a collection of objects of concern that chemists have made and used, a specific area of chemical practice that has not always been had a specific name attached to it, but for a while it did. In the mid-20th century, these were known as collectively the stuff of literature chemistry. So I'm working on a history of this field of literature chemistry, and literature chemistry. The answer to the question I posed of why it is that this particular way of defining chemical substances by molecular structure has been so persistent is, number one, it has some relationship to the material chemical nature of substances in the world. It relates to theories and it relates to experiment, but so do a lot of these different ideas. It relates, molecular structure and binary salts and other particularly persistent ways of defining what chemical substances are relate to chemical theory and experiment, a range of different chemical theories and experiments, robust across different methods, in a way that's really useful for organizing a 50-volume, 2,000-page each handbook, or a database of 100 million substances, or a strict, unambiguous collection of nomenclature rules for mapping a structure of a substance to a name of a substance. So the history of literature chemistry, to go back to the Galison book, I was able to, I've kind of been able to come up with the argument to kind of look for evidence in history, to understand connections between different, the way chemists work with, say, tables of formulas versus indexes of abstract journals, as this sort of coherent enterprise, by thinking about some of the, these ideas of Galison's that I was referring to earlier. So there's a significant stratum of the history of chemistry. Literature chemistry is like a kind of part of chemistry, a specialization of chemistry. All chemists have to engage these information resources. Some of them specialize in producing and using them. And it's intercalated with the other parts of chemistry, just as Galison discussed instrumentation and experiment and theory being intercalated in physics. So it's kind of one level of the practice of chemistry throughout this period. And it's a level that presents a useful way of grasping the shifting historical conceptions of what chemistry and chemists and chemicals are in practice across the entirety of the field. Because many of these resources, abstract journals like Chemical Abstracts, handbooks like Beilstein's Handbook of Organic Chemistry or Gmelin's Handbook of Inorganic Chemistry, specifically aimed to gather up everything, or all chemistry in one place, and so ended up defining what the makers and users of this work thought of as what chemistry was. So you can look to them for one way, a very practical way, right? Not a formalized definitional way based on any sort of first principles about what chemistry is or ought to be, or arguments about what is and isn't chemistry, but a practical way of thinking about, well, if you're a chemist, what are you going to be seeing when you look stuff up about chemicals, and what aren't you going to be seeing? A practical way of defining this field. And as I mentioned, looking at literature chemistry helps account for some of the long-term persistence and continuity in certain conceptions of what chemicals are across changes in theory, experiment, and instrumentation. For example, it's molecular structures. They're kind of Creole used within the works of literature chemistry, whose continuity across time is enabling of some of the developments, and often pluralism and difference in different sorts of theories and experimental methods that has characterized chemistry throughout the period. So I want to leave at least a little bit of time for conversation before I know we have to wrap up, but I want to just briefly mention one other project I've been involved in that this ways of thinking drawn from Galison's book has been useful for me. And that is in an effort with a group based at the University of Wisconsin-Madison to develop resources for advancing causes of anti-racism, equity and justice in the sciences and engineering, mathematics and medicine more broadly. And this is a big, really interesting collaboration. Take a look online, just look up Heal Madison, and you'll find the website funded by Mellon. And the little corner of this effort I'm involved in has involved putting together a short course, mostly right now for graduate students and postdocs and laboratory collaborations on how to make use of history for thinking about different questions of pertaining to equity in science, a matter, of course, very great concern to a lot of folks in the sciences. And so in this short course, which has, is a 3-session course, the middle session of which is field specific, and so I've worked on the chemistry specific version of this. We ask the questions, kind of break down this matter of equity in the sciences to 3 questions. Who's doing the science? What is the science, and who's affected by the science? And these are all different ways in which people have thought about the question of equity, inequity, justice, injustice in the sciences, right? Who has a seat at the table? Who doesn't? What counts as scientific, and what ways of asking and answering questions are excluded as unscientific? And who's the science benefiting? Who is the science and the technologies produced on the basis of scientific research potentially harming? And we work our way through some case studies involving the steroid chemist Percy Julian, a African-American, really interesting biography, among others. But what we try to do, and what I try to work towards, and this is inspired by the trading zone concept, is finding ways of how these different approaches to asking a question about equity in science, right? What is the science? Who's affected by the science? Who does the science? How can these come together? How have they come together for historical actors in a case that we're studying? And how can they come together for us in asking questions about equity in the research that we ourselves are involved in? And the way to get there, I think, again, riffing on thinking with Gallison's model, and thinking with the physicists that he has studied, and how they went about engaging in collaboration is through, conversation. How can we come up with languages that get at the intersection of these different dimensions of equity in science and help us perceive where broader structures of society and institutions might be contributing to supporting equity or working against equity across a number of these different fields, where conversely are there trade-offs, are trade-offs appearing, or people being channeled into working toward equity in one of these areas, but potentially against it in another, and why? What's giving rise to these sorts of conflicts we see arising. So that's another very different sort of area in which I've been making use of some of the ideas that have come to through my reading in history of science. So to wrap up, I think that, and I'll just accelerate. Well, I've gotten to the end of my slides. To wrap up, sorry. The history of science and its neighboring fields, sociology, anthropology, philosophy of science, science technology studies, offer this repertoire of concepts, methods, and stories that I think might be of use to folks working in your fields. I'd be curious to hear what you think, because bringing this potential to fruition will, of course, only come from conversation between folks in your field and mine. So thank you. Please, love to hear questions or comments in the few minutes we have remaining.
Well, I'll just say resounding thank you. I know there's so many questions, so I won't take any time from this last few moments for any of my own, but just really thank you for joining. And Evan has suggested a reading that we can all gather again in 2 weeks from now to discuss. He's got other important commitments during that time, but we can all dig into it together. Thank you so much, Evan.
Thank you, Evan. I'm wondering if we can get a screenshot of your little reading list that you had just a moment before you closed the PowerPoint. Be wonderful to see what's piquing your interest. And then I have kind of a question, but I have another meeting I have to jump onto. But one thing that came up for me in this talk was that we're in the process of sort of trying to almost force feed a new discipline, because the funder is trying to make that a new thing. And so we're in the business of like how do we help researchers span the boundary of what they're currently doing to what we, the funder and the institute that I work in, how do we help them see that there are connections between this, what they're doing and then this new sort of discipline, and teach them new methodologies and new languages and all of that stuff. And there's just so, I'm trying to wrap my head around all of the things that need to be done to create a new discipline, kind of, or I mean, I guess it's already there, but yeah, so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, the question of discipline formation is a really interesting one, and one thing that it takes is time. So that's certainly a big part of the a big part of it. But historically, one thing that a lot of historians have identified as a key marker, in the modern period since the sort of mid 19th century forward, of discipline formation is a journal, right? And so a journal as a place where programmatic public, like statements of what the discipline's concerns are published, where research exemplifying the discipline appears, where boundaries are set through peer review and other mechanisms, and kind of conceptions of what the discipline is are reinforced. So that's a big part of it. But there's there are a number of different factors that have frequently come into play in the emergence of disciplines. There's a book, I'll recommend the introduction to Mary Jo Nye's From Chemical Philosophy to Theoretical Chemistry, which is a history of how physical chemistry came into being as a discipline. And the introduction has a kind of nice 6-point schematic of some features of scientific disciplines, and crucially, a lot of them, are one of them is like a mythology. Basically, one thing disciplines do is they tell stories about themselves that are not necessarily especially accurate, but that are aspirational, right, and provide a common understanding of how they were founded, what the vision of their founding was. Often obscure how the sausage was really made. So, is that the only way that a discipline can come into being? I don't know. Perhaps not. It is something that has frequently taken place historically.
I like this idea of a mythology, because the discipline is there. There is a journal, and the time has not really been there. But like, how do you tell that story of like how this discipline came into being and why it's here, and how can you personally contribute to it? So thank you.
Well, thanks so much again to you all for your time, and I'll send you a quick bibliography as along with the reference to the reading that Christine mentioned to share with the folks in the room and others in your community. Thanks for your attention, and all the best.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Evan.
Take care, everybody. See you next time. Well, Evan, I just wanted to say a final thank you for spending time like this when I know Ramona is